They whispered the moment he stepped inside. Must be another gold digger come to collect. The words weren't loud, but they cut like broken glass against the quiet hush of the chapel. Nathaniel Brooks didn't flinch. He had heard worse. He'd lived worse. Dressed in a charcoal suit that fit just a little too tightly at the shoulders and not quite enough at the cuffs, he stood near the back, where the shadows swallowed names and faces, where no one looked, where no one cared, no one spoke to him, no one asked who he was. They didn't know that the man in the casket, the one resting beneath flowers and carefully curated eulogies, had whispered to Nathaniel every night for nearly a decade, "You are my home." They didn't know about the apartment in Chicago with the warm light in the kitchen and the jazz cassette player that sometimes jammed, or the incense Cassian loved, Cassian Ward, rich and warm, that clung to the curtains even when the windows were open. Or the rainy Sunday afternoons when Cassian would sit by the window and read Yeats or Auden aloud, while Nathaniel brewed tea and watched the sky. They didn't know any of it because Cassian Ward had never told them. Not once. Not even when the illness came. Not even when the doctors said he wouldn't make it to the end of the season. Cassian had been a professor of literature, a man of words, of precision and nuance, but he had never found the courage to say just one sentence, "I love a man." And so, when death arrived, it did not call Nathaniel. It called the ones with the same blood but not the same heart. The ones who had never stepped foot in that little apartment, never held Cassian's hand through the night, while machines beeped steadily like ticking clocks. The ones who had buried their own truths long before the cancer arrived. Nathaniel came to the funeral anyway. Not because he was welcome, he wasn't. Not because anyone had told him the time they hadn't. He came because love doesn't end at the last breath. It lingers. It waits. It shows up, even when no one else will. And so he sat silent, unnoticed in the very last row, while strangers offered hollow praise to a man they only knew in fragments, a man they never really saw. Nathaniel didn't cry. Not here. He had done enough of that at the hospital, in the dark, when Cassian was too weak to speak, but still tried to squeeze his hand. He had done enough crying while folding Cassian's sweaters one last time, or standing alone in the kitchen, listening to the cassette click at the end of a song. In the chapel, he simply listened. He sat with his back straight, his hands folded, and his eyes fixed not on the speakers, but on the casket, because it wasn't the ceremony he had come for. It was the goodbye, and no one could take that from him. Not the sideways glances, not the muttered insults, not the silence that tried to erase 8 years of shared breath, of shared mornings, of love that dared not speak its name, but lived anyway. For 8 years, Nathaniel had been invisible. Now, he was a stranger at his own husband's funeral. But what they didn't know was that he was also the only person who had ever seen Cassian fully. Not the professor, not the obedient son, just the man who hummed out of tune while making toast. The man who had loved quietly but deeply. And though the world refused to name him, Nathaniel had been a husband in every way that mattered. If this story has moved you, subscribe to Heart Story for more powerful, true-to-life tales that speak of quiet love, unseen pain, and the courage to show up anyway. Because sometimes, the people who seem invisible are the ones who carry the whole truth. The ceremony ended with applause, as if the truth had been honored. But the truth, Nathaniel thought, had never stepped into that room. Not once did anyone mention where Cassian had spent his final nights. No one spoke of the quiet room in the palliative wing, where the windows overlooked a parking lot and the only music came from an old portable speaker. No one said who had held his hand as the pain took over, who had memorized the rhythm of his breath, who had whispered poems back to him when his voice gave out. No one mentioned Nathaniel. They had erased him, completely, like he was a footnote that didn't pass editorial review. There was no place for him in the retelling of Cassian's life, not as a partner, not even as a friend, just silence, a vacuum where love should have lived. When the last guest left and the chapel echoed with emptiness, Nathaniel stepped forward, one hand still tucked in his coat pocket, the other gripping a small, worn photograph, the only copy they had ever printed. It was from a winter in Vermont, snow falling thick and clumsy, caught in Cassian's curls while Nathaniel laughed behind the camera. Later that day, they had handed the lens to a stranger passing by. That moment, both of them standing together in coats 2 sizes too big. Cassian's arm around Nathaniel's back had been frozen in time. Now, that memory sat alone at the edge of the casket. Nathaniel placed the photo gently, face up, just near the flowers but far enough from the polished wood. On the back, in Cassian's handwriting, he had once scribbled, "If we can't be public, then let us be remembered." It was the only vow Cassian had ever dared to write. Nathaniel turned to leave. He didn't expect closure. He hadn't come for justice, only memory. But at the door, a man approached him. Older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a gray suit with a lawyer's kind of posture. He held out a sealed envelope. "Are you Nathaniel Brooks?" the man asked. Nathaniel nodded, cautious. "I'm Jerome Heller, Cassian's attorney." His voice was flat, rehearsed. "This is for you." Nathaniel took the envelope. But Jerome didn't walk away. Instead, he paused. "I want to be clear," he added, eyes flicking toward the stained glass window behind the altar. "Cassian didn't leave you anything. There's no inheritance, no shared account, no shared deed. Everything has been transferred to his family. The weight of it didn't fall all at once. It settled slowly, like ash from something already burned down." Nathaniel said nothing, just slipped the envelope into his coat pocket. "No will?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was one," the lawyer said, "but it was revised." Cassian signed a final declaration before his last hospital admission. In it, your name was formally removed. Removed, not forgotten, not missed, deliberately removed. Nathaniel stood alone outside the chapel for a long time, staring at the concrete path that led back to the world. A world where the years he gave the evenings, the soup stirred over low heat, the hospital chairs, the quiet now meant nothing on paper. What they had built was never legal. What they had shared, never documented. And in the end, what could not be proven was discarded. He walked away without anger, but not without grief. Because erasure is not a scream. It's a slow disappearance, one decision at a time. It's the absence of your name on a page that should have held it. And perhaps the greatest cruelty is not being hated. It's being rewritten out of someone's life like you were never there to begin with. But some truths can't be deleted. And real love doesn't vanish just because someone failed to sign it into law. 1 week later, Cassian's family appeared in a glossy lifestyle section of the Sunday paper. The headline was simple but bold: "Literature professor leaves estate to family." There was a photograph too. Cassian's mother holding a framed portrait of her son, his brother standing beside her, proud but distant. Beneath the article was a list: an elegant Victorian home in Evanston, a sizable retirement fund, and an unpublished novel still awaiting literary discovery. Not a word about the man who had shared his life. Not a single mention of Nathaniel Brooks. The world now had a neatly packaged story, a grieving family, a brilliant academic legacy, and somewhere off page, someone erased. Nathaniel read the article in the kitchen of their old apartment, the same apartment he had once filled with fresh lilies on Friday afternoons, the same one that still smelled faintly of cardamom and rain-soaked wool, though it had been months since anyone brewed tea there. Cassian's favorite chair still faced the window. The record player stood idle, and yet the world outside spun on, as if Nathaniel had never existed in it. He hadn't returned to the apartment since the funeral. He wasn't sure why he came back now. Maybe to gather what was left. Maybe to say goodbye in a place that had once held everything sacred. The mail slot clattered, breaking the silence. A thin envelope slipped through and landed at his feet. No name, no return address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, one line, handwritten, hurried. "Go to 44 Ashton Street, second floor. There's something you need to see. Someone who owes Cassian an apology." Nathaniel stared at the words for a long time. The handwriting wasn't Cassian's, but something about the slant, the pressure of the pen, felt familiar, like a voice he hadn't heard in years, whispering from behind a door he hadn't dared open. He went. Ashton Street was quiet, lined with brownstones too narrow for sunlight to set along. The second floor of number 44 was a studio, private, undisturbed, a place Nathaniel had never known existed. The key was under the mat, as promised in the second note taped to the door. Inside, the room was dim but full. Papers, books, journals stacked along the walls. An easel in the corner held sketches of hands, of falling leaves, of two figures walking away from the viewer, their silhouettes unmistakable. Nathaniel's fingers trembled as he stepped deeper. Then he saw it. Near the desk, a leather-bound manuscript, thick and carefully protected. The cover read, "What I Cannot Say in Daylight." And beneath that, one line etched in ink, a novel by Cassian Brooks. Not Cassian Ward, Cassian Brooks. Nathaniel opened the first page. There, in steady handwriting, were the words that undid him to end, "Whom I loved but lacked the courage to stand beside. If the world won't remember your name, let this be your monument." He sat down without meaning to. The room tilted, not with grief this time, but with something heavier, the weight of being seen, even after it was too late to say it aloud. Cassian hadn't left Nathaniel in silence. He had carved their truth into paper, in the only way he knew how. Cassian had signed the manuscript using a name that didn't belong to his family or his students or his past. He used a name that belonged to Nathaniel, that borrowed love and stitched it into identity, that said, "You are mine," even if no one else knows it. And somewhere in the stacks of paper, in the unlined journals and ink-stained notes, Nathaniel began to understand Cassian had not betrayed him with omission. He had tried in secret, in shame, in fear to leave a trace of what mattered most. Some people fight with banners. Some leave behind proof in bank accounts and legal contracts. But others, they leave stories. And in those stories, they write the names they were too afraid to say out loud, so that someday, someone might find them and finally call them home. Nathaniel didn't sleep that night. The manuscript lay open across the dining table, pages pinned down by half-finished mugs of tea. He read each word like it was being spoken directly to him, as if Cassian had found the courage to say everything he never could, not through phone calls, not in hospital rooms, but here, on the page. The novel was a quiet masterpiece. It didn't shout. It didn't beg. It simply told the truth of two men in love who built a world in the spaces they were allowed, who filled the silences with music, who lived half visible but fully real. Nathaniel brought the manuscript to a small independent publisher known for literary risk and stories that didn't fit cleanly into categories. He expected resistance. He expected to be turned away. Instead, the editor listened. Then she read, and then she cried. Legal verification took time. The handwriting was confirmed. Cassian's old emails, notes, and journal entries aligned. Though the manuscript had never been formally registered, one contract dated months before Cassian's final hospitalization showed intent to publish under a pseudonym. The signature at the bottom read, Cassian Brooks, not a legal name, but a name made of something else belonging. The editor asked Nathaniel, carefully, who the other name referred to. He didn't answer. He just smiled. 3 months passed. And then everything changed. The novel, What I Cannot Say in Daylight, debuted with little fanfare. No major promotions, no flashy campaigns, just a quiet release into a quiet world. But it found the ones who needed it. Readers began to share excerpts online, phrases underlined, passages quoted at book clubs, in classrooms, on podcasts. Reviewers described it as a mirror held up to the kind of love that often goes unnamed, resilient, invisible, enduring. One question repeated again and again, who is Nathaniel Brooks? Cassian's family took notice. Not of the story itself, but of the sudden success, of royalties, of recognition. They came forward with lawyers, demanding rights to the literary estate. But Cassian had already signed a temporary publishing agreement. And the named representative of the work, its custodian, was listed clearly, Nathaniel Brooks. The publisher held firm. The manuscript belonged not to the name Cassian was born with, but to the one he chose when he wrote his truest words. Nathaniel declined interviews. He didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want the money. He asked for only one thing, that the author's name remain as it had been written, Cassian Brooks. Because even if the world hadn't accepted their bond, the pages had, even if no certificate had been issued, even if no ring had been exchanged in the eyes of the law, there had been a promise not spoken, not witnessed, but lived. And now, it was immortal, in print, in readers' hearts. On shelves across the country, Cassian's name, the name he created from love, sat beside Nathaniel's, a truth that no longer needed permission to exist. And quietly, Irrevocably, the story of two men who had once been erased had begun to write itself back into the world. Because some legacies are not measured in assets or inheritance, but encourage the courage to name what was once hidden and to protect it long after the world pretends it never mattered. Late autumn carried the kind of chill that seeped into bone, the kind that whispered of endings, but also of memory. Nathaniel stood at the front of the library's small event hall, framed by warm light and rows of folding chairs. It wasn't a glamorous venue, but it was intimate, familiar, the sort of place where words mattered more than names. The book had already been republished 6 times. Tonight was not a launch, not a press event. It was a reading, a tribute, a gathering of those who had loved Cassian's words and felt something shift in their chest when they read about love that didn't beg for approval, only space. Former students came, writers, teachers, quiet men with folded collars, women with notebooks in their hands. Some came because they'd known Cassian in lecture halls. Others came because they had never known him at all, but had cried when a paragraph echoed something they had never dared admit. Nathaniel didn't read the most famous chapter. He chose the quietest one, a passage where 2 characters sit in silence after loss, watching light change on a kitchen wall. He read it slowly, his voice steady, but not cold. These were not someone else's words anymore. They were a promise, kept. As the last line hung in the air, people stood, some applauded, some just pressed tissues to their faces. Nathaniel looked out at them, all this new family born not of blood, but of understanding. And then she appeared, at the edge of the room, hesitant. An older woman in a pale wool coat, clutching something in her hands. Her posture was careful, as if she didn't know whether she had the right to be here. It was Cassian's mother. Nathaniel recognized her instantly. She approached without speaking, eyes red, fingers trembling slightly. And when she reached him, she held out a small wooden box. "I read every page," she said, her voice nearly breaking. "I understand now why he was afraid, but I'm more afraid of something else now that I buried the part of him that was the most alive." Nathaniel didn't respond. He simply accepted the box, the weight of it familiar and foreign all at once. Inside, carefully wrapped in old tissue, was a birth certificate, the original. At the bottom, the section titled Emergency Contact, Next of Kin, had been filled in not with a relative's name, but with Nathaniel Brooks, spouse. In parentheses, the word non-legal had been scribbled, and beneath it, in handwriting that Nathaniel would recognize anywhere. One last note: if the world will not see you, then you will be the one whose name rests where love truly belongs, in the heart. Nathaniel folded the certificate, placed it back in the box, and held it close. He didn't need a courtroom's validation. He didn't need headlines or lawyers or signatures. This quiet recognition, this handwritten truth was all the evidence that mattered. He had been erased. But now, he was written in, not in wills or ledgers, but in legacy. Because sometimes, the truest inheritance is not made of money or property. It's made of memory, of bravery, of the choice to love even when the world refuses to give you a name for it. And when someone chooses you not in front of a crowd, but in the lines of a manuscript, in the hidden signature, in the words they write when no one else is watching, that is love that no inheritance can outweigh. So let me ask you this: would you rather be named in someone's will or in their truth? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched something inside you, don't forget to follow Heart Story, where we honor the kind of love that lives even when no one else sees it.